Hello, I'm Andy, and today I'll be talking about Godzilla. Well, actually, the entire Monsterverse, but mostly Godzilla. There's loads of reasons why people or I like Godzilla. He's a fire atomic breathing dinosaur, he fights giant monsters and aliens, and his arch nemesis are a three-headed dragon, a crab, and a space and mecha version of himself. And these are all great reasons for liking Godzilla. One of my favorite reasons for liking Godzilla is his size. No matter which version of Godzilla you watch, one defining factor of him is that he's huge, a bigger-than-life creature of unfathomable proportions. And the Monsterverse is a great example of using size to your advantage. In 2014, Legendary would bring Godzilla back to the big screen once again, and this time larger than ever, with a new movie with a totally original name, Godzilla. I personally love this movie and still remember watching this for the first time in theaters 10 years ago. One thing I still remember from seeing this movie all those years ago is how big Godzilla looked. Our first introduction to Godzilla is him swimming under battle or navy ships, causing a tsunami just by him entering onto land. And already we have an amazing scene and sense of scale. Seeing Godzilla absolutely dwarf the navy ships just puts into perspective how big he is and how small and insignificant we are. And then we arrive at the airport, where we get to see how big Godzilla truly is. We start with everyone screaming and panicking over the Mewtwo, and then silence. As Godzilla stomps, he shakes the earth, and just one foot takes up almost the entire screen, showing how even planes and explosions are overshadowed by the sheer size of Godzilla. This scene is awesome. From the human point of view in the airport, to a slow shot of the camera panning up to Godzilla's face. We, the audience, for the first time really get to see how big of a creature Godzilla truly is. Now, I could pretty much talk about every scene in this movie, as pretty much every scene in this movie is a great example of scaling. To Godzilla swimming next to naval ships and absolutely outsizing them, and Godzilla ramming straight through the Golden Gate Bridge. But by far the best sense of scaling in this movie has to be the final battle between Godzilla and the Mewtwo's. With the battle taking place mid-San Francisco City, we get to see Godzilla and the Mewtwo's fight amongst buildings, and the cinematography for these fight scenes are amazing, with each monster looking massive. To me, Godzilla 2014 feels the biggest we ever see him in the Monsterverse, which is weird because technically this is the smallest we ever see him in the franchise. And I believe this is all down to one thing, the human point of view. The human point of view is crucial when trying to film scale in a movie, because even as obvious as it sounds, it's how we see and perceive the world. And Godzilla 2014 knows this. During the battle, there are many shots of Godzilla and the Mewtwo's from the human point of view, whether this be in or on a building. This allows the viewer to connect with the movie and scene easily. We all know how big buildings are and probably at least have been in one. And yet, Godzilla still manages to look massive despite how big buildings are. The human point of view really allows the movie to capture the size and scale of the king of the monsters. But with that being said, let's move on to the next installment of this legendary franchise. Kong Skull Island. 3 years after Godzilla 2014, Legendary would release their next movie in the Monsterverse. Not a direct sequel to Godzilla, but instead a new beginning for the 8th wonder of the world, or everyone's favorite monkey. Kong Skull Island managed to make Kong look king-size once again, which is surprising because this is the smallest we ever see him in the Monsterverse. Instead of just using the human point of view in this movie, it uses a lot of other shots, like comparisons and long shots. And long shots when the camera is far away from the character, leaving a lot of empty space in the scene. A great example of this is when Brie Larson's trying to help out the Skirt Buffalo with a helicopter stuck on it. We see just how big the helicopter and Skirt Buffalo is, and how small Brie Larson is compared to both of them, only for Kong to pick up the helicopter and tower over the buffalo. The short scene does a lot, showing the absolute unnatural size of Kong with him literally holding the helicopter like a toy, and making Brie Larson look invisible. And now, I do love this movie for many reasons, and scaling is one of them. Now, I don't think Kong Skull Island quite does the scaling like 2014 did, but there's one scene in this movie that outdoes any scene in 2014, and that's Kong blocking the sun. Whoever decided to use the sun for the size comparison is a genius, as what's bigger than the sun? Okay, actually no, there's couple things bigger, but still, we see the sun as this huge celestial body, bigger than Earth itself, yet Kong still manages to block the sun just by getting up. And of course Kong isn't bigger than the sun, but the camera angle and lighting here is genius. And again, whoever decided to make the scene deserves a golden Titan-sized medal. But for now, let's move on to the return of the king. The long-awaited sequel to Godzilla 2014 would finally be released in theaters 5 years later, Godzilla King of the Monsters. This time bigger, with more fights and more importantly, more monsters. In this movie, Godzilla is 393 feet tall, an extra 39 feet taller than his 2014 self, with Ghidorah being even taller than that, coming at 521 feet. Despite this size increase from 2014 to 2019, I honestly have to say this movie doesn't do Godzilla or Ghidorah's size justice. Sure, they're big, and there were scenes where Godzilla and Ghidorah did look pretty big, but I didn't really get the sense of scale that the 2014 movie set prior. I mean, the only real time I really get the sense of scale of how big Ghidorah and Godzilla are is when we see Ghidorah flying in the skies, and when we see Godzilla awaken from the ocean. Unlike the 2014 movie, where Godzilla or the Mewtwo's looked massive every time they appeared on screen. I think this is due to the change of the camera angle, by favoring the bird's eye view over the human point of view, with the monsters not looking massive next to things they should tower over, like jets and small buildings. But, and that's a big but, there is one scene in this movie that is just of epic proportions and pure awesomeness, and that's of course the Rodan takeoff scene. The scene is what all monster movies should aspire to be. The human point of view is brought back with on the ground shots of the city, and inside fighter jets, giving the scene a true sense of scale and just showing how big Rodan is compared to the city and everything else, with missiles looking like they annoy him more than hurt. And so my favorite shot's gotta be from the fighters, especially right before he takes off. The scene is just amazing, and if you want a deeper and further breakdown of it, please go check out this video. It's very good and it's a great explanation of the scene. Now let's move on to cinema's most iconic movie monsters. If I had to describe Godzilla vs. Kong in terms of scaling, I would say it does a pretty awesome job. It's better overall than King of the Monsters, and in my opinion, on par with Godzilla 2014 in terms of scale. It does have epic shots like Kong Skull Island and King of the Monsters. Some moments of good use of scaling are Kong using a giant waterfall as a shower, which is just a nice and calming scene, especially with the music in the background, which I cannot show you, and Kong and Godzilla fighting on the carrier ship. But the most memorable one's gotta be Kong talking to Gia and Godzilla walking through Hong Kong. This scene really captures the scale of Kong better than ever before, and honestly has to be one of my favorite scenes in the Monsterverse. The scene is just so perfect, with Kong being covered in darkness and taking up half the screen, and with Gia barely being visible, not because of the lighting, but because of how big Kong is and the camera angle. This scene is honestly just perfect, not to mention beautiful, demonstrating a sense of scale in the movie, evoking that childlike awe and wonder. Godzilla walking through Hong Kong is also stunningly well choreographed. The scene is just so epic. The human point of view on the ground manages to make Kong look massive with that classic Godzilla theme playing in the background, which I also can't play for you, which really brings me, and probably a lot of people, back to the older Godzilla movies, and remind us that Godzilla, even though he's a hero, he's still a monster. With that all said though, let's move on to the final chapter so far in the Monsterverse. Godzilla x Kong. Besides that freaky title, Godzilla x Kong does have some pretty cool shots of the monsters, but by far, Shimu really steals the show here. Shimu is by far the biggest titan we've ever met in the Monsterverse, with her towering over Kong and Scar King and even Godzilla. And the best scene that demonstrates this is her introduction. We get this full body shot of her and she's absolutely gigantic, with her sheer size making her look glacierous amongst all the other apes and even Kong. She just looks so opposing here, with the movie using Kong as a size comparison and basically saying that, yeah, Kong stands no chance at winning if he were to try to fight her. She's truly a titan amongst monsters. And that wraps up my scaling of the Monsterverse. If I had to scale each movie overall in terms of scale, I would say Godzilla 2014 is a 10 out of 10 because of the great camera work with every scene in that movie, and with literally every scene in that movie depicting the monsters as these ginormous creatures. Kong Skull Island is also a 10 out of 10 because of the use of camera angles, lighting, and comparisons, making every scene seem out of this world and just absolutely gigantic. Truly a kingly sized movie. Godzilla King of the Monsters is a 7 out of 10. Now, I don't really think this movie is bad or any sense, but I was more so just disappointed by it. Just because it had so much more potential with the monsters being even bigger than they were in Godzilla 2014. Godzilla vs. Kong is a 9.5, as I feel like almost every scene in this movie is just perfect with the size of creatures, but just under Godzilla 2014 or Kong Skull Island. Godzilla x Kong is an 8 out of 10. I feel like this movie does a pretty good job most of the time, but not as good as its predecessors. Overall, I'd say Godzilla 2014 does the best with the scaling throughout the movie, but with every other movie after it having cooler individual scenes. Anyway, tell me which Monsterverse movie has the best scaling in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe, and hit the bell. Thank you all so much for watching, and have a great day. Bye-bye.